Hey everybody, it's Jason Blaha here. Today I want to talk to you guys a little bit about understanding why you cannot separate size and strength. You cannot separate the two. And usually when you make a statement like that, you get several questions, and these are legitimate questions because people ask questions when they don't know the answers, or when they see something that seems to contradict with what you are saying. But it's important to remember that just because we ask a question or we see a contradiction, a potential contradiction, it doesn't mean that contradiction is actually real. It's just that that's what we're perceiving based upon our limited information. And so it's important to explore these things a little deeper. Now, usually the two questions you get are, then why is this guy so much bigger than this other guy who's stronger than him if a bigger muscle is a stronger muscle? And what about things like the pump? What about things like feeling the contraction and all these other questions that people have? And these are valid questions, and so we need to address those. Now, when I say that you cannot separate size and strength, I mean that literally. It doesn't mean a certain training protocol, one of them might not give slightly more size versus strength, and another protocol in the same person might not give a little more of the other. The ratios can be slightly skewed, as much as 10%, 5 to 10% at the most extremes. So hypothetically, yeah, it is possible to train in a way that gets you bigger, that gets you strong a little bit slower, and train in a way that gets you stronger slightly faster, and maybe you gain size a hair slower. But it is impossible, other than a short period of time and a new adaptation to a new exercise, right? A new exercise that you haven't learned the motor pattern to, but in that case, it's only a compound movement. This doesn't happen with isolation movements because there's no motor unit learning to flexing your bicep. You already know how to flex your bicep if you've done any type of curl. But you can't separate the two outside of that initial learning of an exercise. Anytime you stimulate strength gains, the muscle fibers involved get thicker. Even when you're dealing with the neurological function of it, because that's what people talk about. They'll talk about neuromuscular strength. Your nervous system is becoming more efficient and better at the movement pattern, the exercise. That's true. But other than the initial learning sometimes of the exercise, that always occurs when muscle hypertrophy increases. Furthermore, anytime you increase the hypertrophy of a muscle fiber, that muscle fiber always contracts harder. It always produces more force. That fiber is always stronger in direct proportion to the amount of size it gained. So when you understand it from that perspective of, yes, there can be shifts in different fiber distributions of how much one grows versus another, because some fibers grow better than others. Some training might slightly skew faster versus different types of fiber types in their growth, but that's going to be very, very small. You need to understand that's not going to be something that, I need to do 20 rep sets and 3 rep sets to get the most muscle growth. It's not going to work that way. Again, the differences are very, very small. So we get to the other question of, what about the pump and the squeeze and whatever else? Well, those are just after effects, meaning if you get a pump in a muscle and you really feel it cramping and pumping, it's because you fatigued it. Don't you get the same thing if you ride sometimes or jog to exhaustion? Your legs get sometimes a similar feeling. It's an intense fatigue and the buildup of metabolites. Well, that means that you did a fair amount of work, that you really fatigued the muscle. In many cases, that is indicative of stimulating muscle growth. But here's the kicker. If the muscle grows, it will get stronger. In other words, if you come and you do a bunch of these workouts with a bunch of volume on a muscle, and you induce all this fatigue, do you know how to tell if it actually grew or not? Because sometimes we think we grow because we see it in the mirror. That's illusion, guys. You're never going to see significant muscle gains in like 4 or 6 weeks. Okay, it's not going to happen. You might have changed your body fat slightly or whatever. A muscle's not going to grow enough visibly in the mirror. That's just not reality. That's stuff to sell little silly programs. But if you did a bunch of that, and let's say you go to test how strong the muscle is, that will tell you if it grew or not. Because if it grew, that muscle will always be stronger. In other words, even if you're talking about a bicep, if you were to go to a bicep machine and you were to test your 5 rep max, and let's say you could do 25 pounds, right? 25 pounds for 5 or 6 reps, like 6 reps, with the strict form locked into a machine to where you can't cheat and only the bicep can contract. Well, you have an idea on that machine objectively how strong that muscle is, right? Yeah. So if the muscle grew, you should probably be able to do slightly more. Meaning the 25 pound thing, it might go in 2.5 pound increments. You might be able to do the 27.5 for 6 reps now, or you might find that you can do 7 reps. All right, if that happens, your bicep got stronger, did it not? Therefore, you know that it grew. You have an objective measurement that you know that the muscle fibers in that bicep got thicker. And as far as people saying, well, what about feeling the squeeze? You know all mind-muscle connection is using strict form. That's all it is. That's what it means. You will feel a muscle more if you use strict form doing it. But just because you squeeze a muscle doesn't mean that it worked harder. And that's a key point that people need to understand. Guys will say, well, I squeezed my pecs really hard at the top of a press. But if they're not doing any work, does that make them grow? In other words, if you were to just squeeze your chest, do you really think it's going to stimulate much growth? You're going to feel it, it's going to cramp up, but you're only hitting muscle fibers that aren't capable of growing. In other words, if your chest can squeeze really hard with you standing there doing it, it's the same muscle fibers that if you squeeze it at the top of the bench press. Right? You're hitting mostly the really slow twitch endurance type fibers. The force required to contract and squeeze your pecs doesn't require the faster twitch fibers, the ones that are capable of growing. You're not stimulating anything. So then we kind of come over to the other question, because that covers that. That should just be basic physiology. That shouldn't need to be further discussed. That's understood in all the sciences and looking at it and everything else. In other words, the more work you subject a muscle to, the bigger it gets, and the bigger a muscle gets, the more work that muscle is capable of doing, right? That's why your body makes it grow. It makes those muscle fibers grow because of the work you're subjecting to keep you from hurting yourself. It's a survival mechanism to keep you from injuring yourself in such a way that, in a wild environment could lead to your early death. All right, that's why we grow as a result of stimulus. It's a survival mechanism. And it works very well. Most of you who've been training years and gained muscle realize that. It's a nice after effect. Now, as far as the bigger versus smaller guys, it's multifold in nature. What people need to understand, all these guys out here who are smaller, who seem to be smaller but really strong, they have gained muscle. In other words, if you were to take, I don't know, some guy, it doesn't matter, Max Tuning, Richard Hawthorne, whoever, any of these guys who guys are like, man, they're really strong for their size. Well, if we were to take them and have done a DEXA scan on them when they were only deadlifting 300 pounds and squatting 250, right? And you go do a DEXA scan on them when they're deadlifting 600 and squatting 500, I promise you that if you were to do the scan, the muscles in their spinal erectors, their quads, their glutes, their hamstrings, all of that on those lifts are going to be dramatically larger. Dramatically larger. Those muscles have very possibly even doubled in size. Right? But you're dealing with people who have very good neuromuscular efficiency genetically. They have ideal levers. They have ideal insertion points to be really strong on those movements with less muscle gain. In other words, muscle gain is not linear from person to person regarding their strength. In other words, one guy might only need to gain 5 pounds of muscle to put 200 pounds on his squat, right? Because he's very efficient at the exercise. He will have to gain 5 pounds of muscle to put 200 pounds on his squat. And it might take a guy with a different frame, a different muscle fiber distribution, different genetics. He might have to gain 10 pounds of muscle to put that same 200 pounds on his squat. Some people are just much stronger pound for pound than others due to a variety of factors: neuromuscular efficiency, muscle fiber distribution, insertion points, bone levers, okay? But they all have to gain muscle to get stronger. All of them had to. Some just have to gain more muscle than others. Now, the other question becomes, what about some of the bigger bodybuilders? Well, this is where we go back to the point. When I say that you can't train in a way that separates the neuromuscular gains completely from the hypertrophy gains in a muscle. The exception to the rule is there are drugs that will increase the size of a muscle, without increasing the neuromuscular efficiency. And it's not saying androgens can't increase mindset and focus and make you stronger due to aggression. They can. But down at the cellular level and the body level, if a guy trains a certain way and he doesn't train to get much stronger, but he utilizes a lot of these anabolic substances, the muscles will go ahead and grow. He won't get the same proportion of strength. So remember, we went back and said that, in that one case, that one guy needs to gain 10 pounds of muscle versus the other guy needing to gain 5 pounds of muscle to put 200 pounds on his squat. The guy who uses a lot of anabolics, to do it, he isn't training the motor patterns and the movement patterns and the neuromuscular efficiency. He's only getting the direct anabolic stimulus. His squat will still go up. But he might put on 20 pounds of muscle to get that same 200 pounds on the squat. All right, drugs can skew this. This is the primary reason you do see guys who are relatively big, relatively jacked and weak, is because they haven't really trained for strength. They've utilized the drugs to build their muscles. And therefore they end up being pound for pound weaker. But keep in mind, those drugs did make them stronger. In other words, if your bicep grows an inch, I promise you your bicep is a hell of a lot stronger. But if you did it purely through drugs rather than really, really hard training, you're not going to gain as much strength with the muscle gains. You'll still gain strength, but your ratios are going to be different. Drugs can change the ratio of strength to muscle gain in the favor of muscle gain. So hopefully that makes sense and it explains that when you look at that this in its entirety. All right, guys, but that's really all I have to say on that today. I hope it's been informative, and I will talk to you guys next time.